righty. Well, thanks as always to everyone. This is about the Lotus Sutra, which is a collection of teachings of a kaleidoscopic nature in the way that they're presented. And it's a Buddhist scripture. The Lotus Sutra is a Buddhist scripture. The lotus, of course, is a flower that blooms in the mud, that blooms in the swamp, that blooms out of corruption and makes and opens up to the world, and a beautiful fragrance enters the world. That's a lotus. A sutra is from an old Sanskrit word, an ancient term, meaning thread. So it's a term for the literary form in which many of the teachings are presented. Sometimes they're in the form of sutras, and sometimes in other forms: parable, song, story, thought, anecdote, commentary, accounting, straightforward. And so the Lotus Sutra then has a certain particular place in the way that we have come to understand Buddhism. What I would like to present to you is just the way that the Lotus Sutra opens up for us a world in which the insight that is there, and the beauty that is there, and the profundity that is there, is something that is always happening in all these moments and in every way. And though the words are there, the words are just conveyances, or just vehicles. And the meaning or the message is something that is always mysterious and comes into its own in the conscious realization of the individuals who see into it. This is the Lotus Sutra. And it's also, so as a parallel then to the way that the Lotus Sutra works, I am coming toward it from the direction of what I have learned from the poet William Blake, whose voluminous writings bring to our attention so many ways the human faculty of vision is a living energy which can make concepts born anew in our own minds. And so William Blake wrote these lines. He wrote, "And now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." And for William Blake, then, the fourfold vision is the vision of the whole. And by fourfold, he means it's going to have reflections of itself in something like of an intuitively structural kind of way. His fourfold city, for example, of Galganuza, the city of fulfilled imaginative vision. A fourfold vision. In other words, just something that is existing on more than one level. We can just put it that way in general terms. The threefold vision that he speaks of, it is threefold in soft Beulah's night. For William Blake, Beulah was a world of kind of one step beyond just, the bare basic literal world, but a world in kind of a dream of different kind of energies, some of them like social energies, some of them energies of the superficial kind of moralistic superego. I mean, there's that. In Beulah, we begin to learn to see ourselves in a self-conscious way, which can lead us to perplexity, but it's also the beginning of something beyond single vision. And of course, for William Blake, single vision is the state of untruth. And so how does that relate to the Lotus Sutra? Well, we can see something similar when we contemplate the image of the Buddha. And the Buddha, as we are somewhat familiar with, is an actual human being who was born, 400 or 500 years BC in northern India. And he was raised as a prince born into a royal family was brought up under every circumstance of delight and luxury, and great prophecies were spoken over him and in the air all around him about what he was going to grow up to be. It is said he was his mother and father's only child, and they had all their hopes for him to become a king. And it was prophesied in so many ways that he would become a king. And then some of the sages and some of the rishis and some of the visionaries in their fourfold vision, they said, well, he might be a great king. If he becomes a king, he will be a great one, but he might also be a great teacher. A great teacher, a world teacher who will teach of the nature of spiritual truth. And his father, the king, well, he did not like that aspect of it. He wanted a king to follow in his footsteps and to rule. And so that's just part of the drama of his life. But eventually, things turned in such a way, the destiny of this young prince began to unfold in such a way that his contemplative gifts were so strong, and the events and the turnings of fate and fortune in his life brought about his called him away from his home into the world where, in all kinds of ways, he undertook severe penances and dedicated himself to the deepest possible study without a roof over his head, studied under many teachers, and eventually turned aside from the excesses of those teachings. And the time came, the circumstances were right for this prince, Siddhartha. That was one of his names, Sakyamuni Buddha. He is also called the historical Buddha, Siddhartha, which means the name given to him by his mother and father, which means the one who brings about all good. Anyway, Siddhartha, the once a prince, but now an engaged and intense, wandering hermit. The time was right, the circumstances were right, and he sat under the Bodhi tree. And in a single night, the fourfold vision, as William Blake would put it, came to him. And the causes of suffering, the presence of suffering, the remedy for suffering, and the path to live a life free from suffering and to help others, to awaken others, that became clear to him, important to understand, in meditative vision. And so it's always going to have that particular quality that is uncanny. And when we study it or when we contemplate it in our own kind of poetic sense, there will always be that about it all. It's just that eludes us, and yet that also that calls to us and beckons us, and also frustrates us and sometimes compels us. But after this illumination, he went into the world again and taught what he had been given. He wanted to, it was part of the way that these things work. What he had been given in vision, he was going to make available for others as the natural way that the Spirit conducts itself when it is in the presence of a truthful life. And so for now, of course, more and more he was referred to as the Buddha, because Buddha means awake. When he came back out from under the Bodhi tree, Bodhi means wisdom, after his illumination, and returned to some of the communities of rustic meditators that he had been meditating with, they did notice a change in him. And he was asked by someone, "Are you a god?" And he replied, "No." "Then what are you?" they asked. He said, "I am awake." Awake. And Bodhi, Buddha, it means awake. And so after that, he lived many decades after that, and made many contributions to the community, and made many relationships, and established a community And the community came out of an ages-old contemplative tradition with many, many elements to it, and organized a community of monks and nuns, and a network of lay people also, and some degree of royal sponsorship, patronage, you might say. Well, patronage, but not in the sense of corruption, but just, yes, there were kings who understood his work and were able to provide various forms of help. And in this way, then, this was the establishment, this community, centered around this individual who experienced this vision and communicated it in this particular way. These are the historical circumstances out of which what we call now Buddhism emerges. But like any religion, or like anything like this, like any legend, it has too many to count, too many aspects, too many features, and there are too many ways to study it and to think of it. And some of the ways that are easy to study and think of it, are not that's not where my head is at right now. I want to look at it more like something that is announcing itself to me in much the same way that a poem becomes clear to one when one is writing a poem, or when one is making a picture, or when one is seeing or thinking, or in some sense that is free from the usual constrictions that that so often we think of as normally kind of like holding us back, And so in that way, then we can bring in some more of these kind of elements that are somewhat familiar, and then perhaps they still have illuminations for us. So anyway, so this was the Buddha's life in a short thumbnail sketch. And after he passed away, traditionally around the age of 80 or so, 80, and that's a long time, for back then, for 500 BC. After that, this community, well then, what was the meaning of it all now? Well, there were the voluminous teachings and the talks that he gave, and the instructions related to so many of the aspects of living that had meaning for not only the monks and the nuns and the community around him, but for all the people in all the walks of life, in the villages and in the cities and in the countrysides of India at that time. And these things were recorded in the way that they were recorded back then. When I say recorded, that's another thing. I don't want us to take that in the way that we might usually take that. In other words, notated. I mean, yes, they were notated, but what was it that was being preserved? What was it that was being kept? What was it that was being renewed? Well, here's what it was. The disciples around him, the ones who attended to his words, they were listening. They were listening in the way that they had learned to listen. They were listening in the way that they were inspired to listen, brought into that state of receptivity by the message and the meaning of what the Buddha was teaching them. So they remembered it. This was how these teachings began to be passed down, through memory, from the ear, through the memory, and then onto the page. Was it the page? Well, no, this was ancient times. Literally, they were leaves. They were leaves, and they were written down in the vernacular language, a Proto-Sanskrit language called Pali, P-A-L-I. And there were many Proto-Sanskrit vernaculars at that time. This particular one was called Pali, and they were written down on leaves, with well, I don't know, were they ink brushes and then they were kept. They were kept in the memory. They were contemplated, and then they found their way into written form. That's what I want to say. And when they found their way into written form, it's important to understand that they were written down as sutras, and and also in verses. It was prose and it was verse mixed, and the verse was there because the ways that people remembered it and passed it on in cultures like this, they remembered it. And the verse was the form that made it more possible for it to be remembered in the ways that the people remembered things. It was metrical and concise in all these different ways. And then the prose passages were more like commentaries or amplifications of what was being written down. And so this became the written form in which these teachings are passed down through time, the way that this knowledge is passed down through the generations. And what did they call it? They called it the triple basket, the triplicata, the triple basket, of which is they kept baskets of leaves. The source of the Buddhist books were baskets of leaves, and so the thought, as always. Thought never stays the same. It's never the same message in a certain sense in any kind of visionary utterance or in anything that is given to human beings of this nature. It will partake of the creative change. It comes out of creative change and it enters the world, and it is heard by people, and it goes into their spirit, and it undergoes this creative change. And of course, this can be good and this can be bad. It can be understood correctly, and it can be terribly misunderstood. And human history, much of human history is what we see, the working out of religious revelations. We sometimes see this, and it's easy to, especially nowadays. There's a certain kind of extremely cynical and yet highly suggestible form of cynicism that goes out there when people are talking about religion and religious history and all of this. And so, but we don't have to do that because we are approaching it as individuals, trying to understand it in our own visionary imagination, which does exist. And the Lotus Sutra actually affirms this in a great many creative ways, actually. Well, anyway, so the baskets of leaves, they a certain body of teaching and concise formulations. The Four Noble Truths, the Six Afflictions. There are a great many of these kind of like very concise teachings that are given, but they're all very in very general form. And it's kind of like the understanding comes that in those early times, the path for one who was a disciple of the Buddha, perhaps even if one was a Shrivaka, one who actually heard the Buddha's voice. Vaka means voice. A Shrivaka. Let's talk about that. The Shrivaka and the Arhat. There's another term, Pratyekaya Buddha, I think is what they call it. Arhat, Pratyekaya Buddha. There's some difference, but as far as I understand it at this point, they're basically the same. But what that means is the path of the Arhat. One learns the teachings, lives the life, understands the understandings, and in so doing steps away from the wheel of samsara, the wheel of phenomenal existence, going around and around, lifetime after lifetime, making the same mistakes. But with the understanding comes extinguishment, also called nirvana. And one steps away from this endless cycle of rebirth and enters nirvana, which is translated as extinguishment, which could be, in a certain sense, nothingness, a great purification of sense appearances into just this realm of utter purity. It's understood and misunderstood in a million different ways, of course. But the thing that I want to stress at this point is that the Arhat is the salvation, the extinguishment, the nirvana, the realization, the enlightenment, the insight is all for the Arhat, all for the one who follows the path. Okay? And this came to be known as Theravada Buddhism. And it came to be known as something began to change. And this is, I believe, the Lotus Sutra began to be compiled and collected and began to take on an identity as the Lotus Sutra in about the 2nd century AD, as I understand it. And so what 700 years after the life of the Buddha, and a great many very creative changes were happening in the thought of what all this, of what it meant, of what the teachings of the Buddha meant. And there came to be certain proto-Lotus Sutra type scriptures that expressed a greater vehicle, right? A greater vehicle. By vehicle, a body of thought along which one would travel down the path, I guess you might say, a greater vehicle. And it came to be called, and of course, that there is self-importance in competition, in these early monks and thinkers who were compiling these things, because eventually it began to be called Theravada Buddhism, came to be called the lesser vehicle, and then there was the greater vehicle. And what was the greater vehicle? That's what we know now as Mahayana Buddhism. And so there's a key way to understand this distinction made between Theravada and Mahayana. And it has to do with the path and the fulfillment, of the arhat and the meditator. And it's a totally different kind of consciousness of the fulfillment of this revelation. So what I'm saying then is, at this point, it seems it makes sense to me to contrast the arhat, which is the one who has found enlightenment for themselves and nirvana and all this, with the bodhisattva. And of course, the bodhisattva is the one who has not only discovered enlightenment and the source and the origin and the meaning and the destination of all thought and of all understanding, but does not disappear into nirvana, does not step away from the wheel always and forever, like a moth into the light and is gone. No, that is understood, of course, but not chained to the concepts of existence and non-existence, or even enlightenment and non-enlightenment. The bodhisattva is one who, out of love for the human creatures and love for all creatures and all things, because to the extent that they are real, they have Buddha nature, perhaps dormant, perhaps in a gradual process of change. But the bodhisattva is one who doesn't enter nirvana and disappears, but actually agrees willingly to be reborn again and again and again. Not only to be reborn necessarily, but just to become anything in existence, in any world, for the purpose of furthering the understanding and enlightenment and to ease the suffering of the fellow beings in all the worlds. And this is the path of the bodhisattva. It is called the greater vehicle. And so the Lotus Sutra, then, from a historical standpoint and the development of this kind of thought, is a massive and key text in the formulation of the understanding of Mahayana Buddhism and of the path of the bodhisattva. And so that's kind of how we can begin to understand it. But what about we look at it as something in fourfold vision that unfolds before us, because it's meant to work that way. We are meant to, and we do, in a certain sense, we enter into the reality of the teaching of the Lotus Sutra when we understand what's happening in it. So, but the historical circumstances, the historical understanding of it has a definite start. It is an epic kind of mythical story, but like all epic mythical stories, it has certain very specific circumstances of time and place. And it so happens that in the story of the Lotus Sutra is that the Buddha is giving a discourse, preaching a sermon, offering a teaching in a place he likes to be, in a place he likes to go, on Vulture Peak. And Vulture Peak is a mountain in northern India, and it's a real mountain, but it seems that he is giving this speech on this mountain, and gathered to hear it are a great many characters and persons associated with his historical life, a great many, and community members and monks and nuns and princes and princesses and family members gathered all around. But in the realm of the ultimate dimension, others are gathered around also. All the great bodhisattvas are all there to hear the Lotus Sutra. And they, the bodhisattvas, right, the ones invisible to twofold vision, and of course to single vision, and even to threefold vision, the ones are semi-visible in threefold vision, but fully visible in fourfold vision, which will be unfolded as time goes on, eventually, no matter how many lifetimes it takes. But all of those bodhisattvas, they are all gathered around too, and they each are understanding it in their own way, and they each are participating it in their own way, and they all have always participated in the Lotus Sutra in their own way. And how is it possible to understand it? Well, the Buddha is seated. He is beginning his teaching to the ones who are there. He gives a certain Mahayana Sutra, speaking it, and then he goes into a state of meditative repose for quite a while, it seems. And then a beam of light comes from his third eye, and the beam of light, for those who are attuned to it, illuminates the presence of all the other bodhisattvas who are all around. And they themselves are commenting on it. And so the bodhisattva Maitreya says, "Oh, I've seen it before. I've seen it before in the dimension that I come from," says Maitreya. "Ah, yes, when he does this, when the beam of light comes out after he delivers a certain sutra, falls into repose, samadhi, meditation, and then looks up and the beam of light comes out of his forehead, sometimes it's the crown of his head, that's when he's about to preach the Lotus Sutra." Yes, and Maitreya, the bodhisattva, says this. And then another bodhisattva, Manjushri, says, "Oh, yes, and what does it mean when he's doing this?" And Maitreya says, well, you have done this also. You have been here also. Let us see what happens and see how it unfolds. And then, so they're aware of it. But the people who are in the world of time and space, they don't see this. They see the Buddha uttering a few words and then falling silent. Now there's an actual Shrivaka, one who has heard the voice of the Buddha, an actual disciple nearby, Shariputra. And Shariputra says, oh, please speak. And the Buddha says, the wisdom and the understanding of the Buddha far surpasses the understanding of the Srivakas and the Arhats and the Pratyekya Buddhas. The wisdom is too profound and too subtle. It cannot be achieved. And he doesn't say anything more. And Shariputra continues to ask the Buddha to please speak. He continues to press his case. He says, this teaching that you speak of, why? And he asks a very apt question. He asks a simple question. Well, first he entreats him to continue. And then he says, this understanding which you say is too subtle for us to reach. Why is it that way? He's asking a simple question. Why? He's not asking him to illuminate it to him as if that was impossible. He's asking, why is it so impossible? And he asks him, I think, 3 times. And out of courtesy, the Buddha begins to speak to Shariputra. And I want to tell you about Shariputra for just a moment. He was a disciple of the Buddha. And in some of the later sutras, hundreds of years later, actually, in the early beginnings, in the early formulations of the Mahayana, Shariputra is kind of a nobody, or kind of the butt of a joke. Shariputra is made to represent the lesser vehicle. And other personages in some of the other sutras and some of the other stories are actually of greater understanding. But in the Lotus Sutra, the place of Shariputra, the disciple, is changed. And he becomes actually the impetus for the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, because eventually when the Buddha does start to speak again to a person in time and space, it is to Shariputra that he begins to speak, and he begins to talk about the nature of the one vehicle, of the great vehicle. And how does he do so? He does so in the form of, in a language that is not in the form of a prose sutra, not in the form of verse, but in the form of a basic and simple parable or a basic and simple story. He talks about the three realms, and this is one of the earlier manifestations of the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. On Vulture Peak at that time, but like I say, this text is simultaneously happening all the time. The Bodhisattvas know it, each in their own way, but now Shariputra is hearing it in his own way. It could even be that Shariputra is the one who relates this particular parable, which comes to us from the Lotus Sutra, but it's based on the Buddha's teaching that there are the three realms, of samsara, in the phenomenal world, is on fire, right? It is on fire with suffering. It is on fire with pain, and time is like a fuse. It's burning along, you see. It is on fire. It is like a house. Yes, it is like a house, a fire, actually. And in the parable, it is related that there is a house of fire. The house is on fire. It's a luxurious house, though it is a mansion, and it has many, many rooms. And there is the father, who is a rich and prosperous merchant, perhaps even a king, and he has many children in many rooms, and they're all playing, and they're all having a good time, too good a time. They don't realize that the house is on fire. And he calls out to them, children, children, in my many-roomed mansion, it's on fire. You've got to get out. You've got to be safe. But they don't listen. It can be this way, They're having such a good time. They don't pay any attention to him. And he can continue to try to overpower, the momentum of their attention. But it's not going to work. There's too many rooms, there's too many children, and the flames are already encroaching. So he resorts to a clever or a skillful way to get their attention. He says to them, oh, children, outside I've got something for you. I've got many, many wagons, many, many carts, and they got their carts, they have carpets, they have blankets, they have bells, they have whistles, and they're pulled by different wonderful animals. Some of the carts are drawn or pulled. Some of the carts are drawn by a deer. Some of the carts are drawn by a goat. You would like that, wouldn't you? And some of the carts are drawn by an ox. Come on out and see and go for a ride. And appealing to them in this way, they drop what they're doing and they come out to see the carts and everything. And they all come streaming out of the mansion, saved from the fire, just in time to see not many carts drawn by deer or goats or many oxen, but no, one beautiful, vast cart drawn by a white oxen. A beautiful and magical white oxen, a single vehicle drawn by a single white oxen. And it works. They climb on. They forget that they were told about, deer and goats and many carts. They climb into this one beautiful cart, and it's wonderful, and they go along, and they go on down the road, and they escape from the fire. And I cannot tell you who did this. Was it one of the bodhisattvas who asked another bodhisattva? Was it Manjurshi asking Maitreya? Or was it actually, I think it was the Buddha asking Shariputra on Vulture Peak there, sitting on the ground. After relating this parable, he said to Shariputra, now why? No, he asked him, was the merchant, was the king, was the father, was he lying? Was he lying when he said that to the children? Because after all, he said that there would be many carts drawn by a goat and a deer and many oxen. But it wasn't that way at all. It was one cart drawn by one oxen. Did he lie? And I think Shariputra is the one who answered and said, no, I don't think he lied exactly. Why? The Buddha asks the disciple. so that in a certain sense the teaching is drawn from the disciple. This is the way that the truth works, actually, of course. We know this. And the Lotus Sutra gives us a skillful way to understand it. But so Shariputra says something to the effect of, well, he wasn't lying. I mean, it wasn't like that it was actually literally like what he said was going to happen. No. But first of all, he understood the way that these children were thinking. And he knew that it would not work for him to shout to them about the danger, that they would not listen. He tried it, but only as long as he realized it wasn't going to work. And instead, he spoke to them in the language that they would understand. He spoke to their hopes and their expectations about what they would see and what they would like. And when they came out, when they changed from where they were when they went outside, so to speak, they saw what before they could only be appealed to in terms of the way that they thought. When they came out, their eyes were opened more clearly, and they saw a single vehicle and a single and majestic thing, which is far greater than anything that the Father was saying to them to get their attention. So it's not like he lied. No, it's a little bit different. And it is here that the Lotus Sutra, and this is another reason why we can look at it as something that's kind of a landmark of thought. Not only does it bring us the concept and present it to us of the Bodhisattva, but it also brings us the awareness of this great virtue, of this great teaching, of this great concept that the Buddha taught of skillful means. Skillful means. I think that the Sanskrit word is upaya, skillful means, and what it means is this parable of the burning house, a famous parable, is an example of skillful means. Skillful means it is because consciousness is appealing to consciousness, and what consciousness has available to it is deep and infinite intelligence, and in the form of practice, in the form of action, in the form of choices, and in the form of decisions, skillful means is good. It's good to have access to the way that things will work so that the teaching can be furthered, so that souls can be saved, you might say, so that people can be rescued from the existence of human consciousness, which is on fire from all of its afflictions. Skillful means, upaya. And so these two concepts are a very important part of the Lotus Sutra. Well, and then it goes on from there in so many ways. It is said that there are two kinds of ways to understand the way that the Lotus Sutra works. Speaking of fourfold vision, threefold vision, single vision, and all this. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his wonderful commentary on the Lotus Sutra, speaks of this, but the theme is always there, I think. But he speaks of two dimensions: the historical dimension and the ultimate dimension. And we are taught again and again to understand that these two dimensions are not really two different dimensions. No, it's like what William Blake said. To see heaven to see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. It's that kind of understanding. This is where we talk about the historical dimension and the ultimate dimension being one dimension. In the Lotus Sutra, we can see that with the Buddha sitting there speaking to the people under the hot sun on Vulture Peak, and yet at the same time, the visionary realms are all there. And they are opened up, though, in the Lotus Sutra, kind of in this progressive kind of way. It is said that the first part of the Lotus Sutra concentrates on the historical dimension, and then the second part of the Lotus Sutra goes more and more into the different worlds of the Bodhisattvas, and in the worlds of the Bodhisattvas, in the ways that they have enacted or participated in or listened to or themselves spoke the Lotus Sutra in a universal kind of sense, because all the Bodhisattvas are in lifetime after lifetime, they are not limited to this structure and form called the human personality, which in itself is changing all the time, even in history, in cultural history, but even in our own individual lives. We come to understand ourselves in different ways as we go on, and we begin to realize, from its own side, and this is the teachings of Buddhism, the teachings of emptiness, that things from their own side, actually are empty, but they come to exist only in relationship to other things. And then even those kind of relationships where things appear are themselves subject to change. These are great and vast and subtle kinds of understandings. But it seems to me clear that we each all the time, have our own way of knowing how this can be true, and of bringing ourselves further into understanding how it can be. And of course, reading literature like this is one way that can manifest or become real, and in our minds, and then in our lives and in our practices and in what we do and relate to the world. You see, and so, and in terms of like heaven in a wildflower and the ultimate and historical dimensions, there are so many terms, but in Buddhism there's a concept called the trichiliocosm. And there's a phrase or something where the Buddha puts his tongue out and covers the trichiliocosm. Does that mean he sticks out his tongue and covers the cosmos? Well, it, literally maybe, but actually what that does actually mean is the concept is such that it spans all the different worlds of manifestation. The trichiliocosm is a thousand-fold kind of world. There is a cosmos, a thousand-fold, made of many, many cosmoses themselves, formed of thousands and thousands of cosmoses. And then there's a third cosmos, a cosmos of a third order, which contains all these billions and billions of cosmoses. And in meditation, when the Buddha was under the Bodhi tree, this kind of understanding was apparent to him in every grain of sand, in every leaf on the ground, in every blooming flower, in every stirring of wind, in all these ways, you see. And in every sound that he heard also, because, the vibration brought him the actual spirit of things. It's also something to understand in the historical dimension. When the Buddha was a child, actually, to return to the Buddha's historical life, when he was a child, he would go into the garden, the palace gardens, and even though he excelled in his studies in the local kingly academy, where they taught not only reading and scripture and music and all of this, but also the warrior skills of archery and all this other stuff. He was more in the rough and tumble games of children. He was more one who liked to spend time thinking on his own, and it came naturally to him, this meditation. But also, he would go into the garden, and it was such, the vibration was such that, the wild animals would come right up to him, the squirrels and the monkeys and the deer, and they would draw near to him. He would sit quietly, and they would eat out of his hands. They would eat food out of his hands. And what I want to tell you, though, is on the one level, we can understand this, the magical rapport of the awakened consciousness with the creatures of the natural world. Yes, but notice also there's a certain upaya here, a certain skillful means that we can see, because he knows to bring the food in his pockets that each creature wants. He is giving them something that they want. Do I want to say giving them? Yes, but more specifically, he is offering something. But it's something that they want. He's offering it to them out of his hand, and they are the ones who take it in the ways that they want to take it themselves. But it's skillful means also because it is certain, it is the things that he knows that they want. So he's not going to pick out something that the creature is not going to want. He's going to bring what they want and give that to them, and that requires selection, and that requires kind of discernment and all of this. And so we see that also in the ways that he conducts himself, even from childhood. You see. Now, So we've talked about the Arhat, the path of individual salvation. We talked about a little bit about the Bodhisattva and the different Bodhisattvas and the way that they work and the way that they manifest. We've talked about skillful means, upaya, and the ways that the Dharma, which is, these Buddhist terms, they can mean so many things. They're very subtle. Dharma can mean phenomena, but Dharma also means kind of like law, and way, and so yeah, skillful means, and but there's also universality or inclusiveness, you see, of a skillful patience. You see, when a bodhisattva, is agreeing to go through as many rebirths as it takes to bring all beings across the river, to bring all beings to enlightenment. You've heard it before, and it's true. No one makes it until everybody makes it. And the Bodhisattva is the one who is dedicated to this in this particular way that we can see. And so there's a certain, it's a phenomenally, it's difficult to understand just the nature of the inclusiveness of it, and it cannot be understood by the rational mind. But the patience, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And it can happen in a moment, it can happen instantaneously, it can happen now, or it doesn't happen at all. But it doesn't matter to a bodhisattva, because they are dedicated to bringing it about through all of their different skillful means. So it's almost like time and the different biographies of all these magical beings are simply ways that are presented to us just to see how this event, which actually is beyond time, continues to unfold itself time after time after time. And so that, for example, in one of the later chapters of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is looking at the people and making predictions about their attainments and what they will, the way that they themselves will become Buddha. This is the message that he's giving. This is what he's saying. It's like, you may have been told from before that the way off of the endless stream of rebirths is to undergo austere practices, which only a monk could actually undergo. If you're a townsperson or a farmer or something, you'll never be able to do it. And so all you'll be able to do is offer prayers to the Arhats in the hope of becoming a Buddha in a future life. This was the way that the religion was actually, it had decayed at that point. I mean, if a religion is offering in return for favors and things, solutions and cessations from suffering to be from a previous life, if a privileged class is offering it to a class that doesn't have these privileges, well, we see this again and again, and it happens, in a certain sense in all religions. Well, the Lotus Sutra's teaching frees us from this kind of understanding, at least in our consciousness. Of course, society is not catching up to that. It maybe eventually someday, but in our own consciousness, we can understand through the teachings of the Lotus Sutra and through many other understandings and revelations that come to us that that Buddhahood, and he explicitly says it in a million ways in the Lotus Sutra. Bodhisattvahood, Buddhahood, is available to everyone. It is possible for everyone. Buddha always says, I am a human being. What I have attained, you can attain. It is open to everyone. For example, in the Lotus Sutra, he looks out at one of his enemies in his historical life, at Devadatta. And Devadatta has done a great many bad things. I'll tell you about them perhaps. But in the Lotus Sutra, he says to Devadatta, Devadatta, you too will be a bodhisattva. Devadatta, in a previous life, I was a king, and you were a rishi, a a visionary, an illuminated hermit. And you taught me in a previous life, in the ultimate dimension, you taught me the Lotus Sutra. You set me on this path of understanding. You, Devadatta, in this life are Devadatta, but in a previous life, you taught me. Sometimes Buddhists will say this, your grossest and worst enemies in a previous life, they were your mother. And sometimes they tell us, and this is the endless cycle of the rebirths of a bodhisattva. Everyone at some time is everyone else's mother. Everyone at some time, no matter how bad they are, has been something else in a previous time or in a future time. And we're talking about a time in a certain sense where even though they unfold in our to our cognitive capacities, in reality, of course, it is all simultaneous. It's just right there in the palm of the hand. The trichiliocosm is encompassed by the speech, you see, and by the stories. And yes, Devadatta, who, from the very beginning, Devadatta, let me tell you, in Buddha's historical life, when he was in the garden, through his skillful understanding of the food that the animals wanted, he was sitting in the garden, and he looked up, and there was a flock of wild swans flying in the sky. And then a streaking arrow flew up in a straight line, straight and true, and struck the wing of one of the swans, who fell to the ground and landed at the feet of Prince Siddhartha, the one who would in the future be called the Buddha, but now he was just a young prince in a garden. He was a kid feeding the squirrels and the monkeys and the deer. And now a wounded swan fell at his feet with the arrow still sticking out of it. He reached down, of course, and with his gentle ways, just instinctually, he knew not to make any sudden moves or startle the swan. He spoke to the swan in a soothing voice. He saw skillfully that the arrow had not penetrated deeply. It was not a serious injury. It was a simple matter to remove the arrow. He put it on the ground, and then he was carrying, ready for any possibility, some salve or ointment, which he smoothed onto the wound, and he spoke to the swan in soothing words. He saw that the swan was shivering with cold, perhaps, or shock or fear, and so he wrapped the swan in his own shirt and held it close to him, and he was, you'll be okay, it's just going to take a while. He was talking to the swan, when suddenly he heard footsteps, and into the garden ran his cousin Devadatta. From the beginning, it is told, Devadatta came running in. Devadatta was Siddhartha's cousin. It's a family thing, these royal families, and they're all being educated in the same academies. And also, I must tell you, they are Kshatriyas. They are not Brahmins. They are not the priestly caste. Siddhartha was a Kshatriya. They are the warrior caste. And out of the warrior caste, as so often happens, come the rulers. And so in the academies, they are taught the skills of not only of the scholar and all, but of the warrior. And Devadatta, he's charismatic and smart, and he's a skilled warrior, even as a child. And so Devadatta came running in, and he said, Siddhartha, good news. I was practicing with my bow and arrow, and I shot at a swan, and I hit it. I hit it. It's around here somewhere. Good news, I got one. Where is it? And then Devadatta noticed at Siddhartha's feet there was an arrow. It was his arrow. Hey, that's my arrow. He picked it up and he saw the blood on it. Hey, yeah, I got it. But where's the swan? And then he looked at Siddhartha and what Siddhartha was holding. And he said, You have my swan. You are holding the swan. Give it to me. I got it by rights. It is mine. Give it to me. But Siddhartha said, the swan needs to stay with me so that I can care for it until such a time as it can be released back into the wild because it's wounded. But Devadatta wasn't even thinking along those lines. Devadatta said, no, I got it. It belongs to me. Give it to me. And Siddhartha said, no. And so there was a bit of back and forth. And then Siddhartha said, my cousin, the royal court is nearby. We can just simply walk to the royal court because you know what adults do in situations like this. When they have a conflict, they go before a judge and they each present their side of the story to the judge, and then the judge rules in the favor of one or the other. Let us do like the adults do, Devadatta. One day perhaps we will be kings. We need to learn. Let's go to the court and tell them about our real life situation here. And Devadatta agreed to this because actually he thought that he could win, and because he was very persuasive. And they went to the court. It was not far away. These two children, they walked in. And of course, I think that the king was there, Siddhartha's father, and the other royal people were there, as well as those who were functioning as judges. There was more than one of them. And they came in, and at first the adults said, go back and play, go back and play. We don't want to be bothered by this. But when they understood the situation, one of them said, they will be kings someday. We have to let them learn how to conduct themselves as adults in these kind of situations. So, boys, present your story. And so Devadatta said this. And now understand that this is the logic of the Kshatriya. And so it has persuasive, it makes sense to them. Devadatta said, look, I shot the swan. It was my arrow that struck it. It was my merit as a warrior. This is how I acquired it. It belongs to me. It is very simple and plain and clear that it does. And then Siddhartha said, the swan needs care and rest, and it will heal, and then it needs to be free. But until it is healed and until it is free, it needs me to take care of it. And some of the judges were persuaded by Devadatta because of his impeccable Kshatriya logic. And others of the judges were thinking, well, now actually, kings are warriors, but they also need to be merciful and kind and to care for things. So there is that in the tradition that would indicate that Siddhartha is the one who is right. And then the other ones are saying, no, it's winners who take. To the victor goes the spoils. The swan was brought down by a weapon, so it is a spoil, and because of that, it does belong to Devadatta. And, in their own way, from their own side, of course, they were right. And they were sort of at an impasse. But the story tells us that at a certain point, when everyone was kind of at an impasse about who to award the swan or who to give the swan to, the door just opened up. Did a breeze blow, or was it something else? The door just opened up, and in walked an old man nobody had ever seen before. He seemed by his demeanor to be a hermit, and hermits were respected, even in royal courts. And sometimes holy men could walk in like this, and sometimes they could advise kings, not always, but it was not unheard of that everybody would stop and look up and see this strange person. But on the other hand, nobody had ever seen this person before. He wasn't known by anyone. And anyway, he walked in, this old man, and he just said, every creature wants to live. This is what we know about all living things. They want to keep living. They want to live. Now, said this old man, that boy over there, does not, or it doesn't matter to that boy over there that whether the swan lives or not. As a matter of fact, probably the swan would not live because of that boy's action. Whereas this one over here is honoring this basic truth that living creatures want to keep living. And because that one, he said, pointing to Siddhartha, because that one is helping the swan to protect its life and to keep its life, then he should have the swan. And this was like a different order of judicial thinking. And it was apparent and plain to them. It just, the doors of their consciousness, of everyone present, were just opened. In a certain sense, it wasn't a big deal. It's not a big deal to realize, oh, this is true. Oh, this is true morally. I can take the cause and effect reasoning and the reasoning of satisfaction of wishes and things. I can take all that only so far. But then the wind opens a door and someone I haven't seen comes in and tells me something that I know is true. And the truth of it just encompasses everything that we were arguing about. So it puts it on a different dimension of understanding. It was like everybody at once was kind of like, oh yeah, this is true. It wasn't like you're right or you're not right. It was more like this is true. It's like their attention was put on things in a different way. And so that's why Siddhartha was able to keep the swan and take it home. He took the swan and he kept it home. And it wasn't very long until the swan was better. It's true that the wound was very superficial, though there was blood. But when he knew, when he had an idea that the swan was healed, he took it out to the garden and he held out the swan like this. And he was going to let it go, but he didn't go like that. He didn't drop it, Instead, he still held the swan. And he lifted it, and he brought it down, and he lifted it, and he brought it down. And you see, when he brought it down, it was just natural that the swan's wings would kind of like open up, and then it would close again. In other words, Siddhartha was kind of just, it's skillful means again, I would think. And it's also like a middle path. It's like a middle path. It's like they say sink or swim, and they say stuff like that. And sometimes that's the thing to do. But other times it's nice to be able and skillful means and good to be able to just demonstrate in a certain sense, with support. This is what is happening. When you fly, feel that that's your wings. They're moving up and down, you see. And that's where the wound is. Does that hurt a little bit? Here, let's exercise a little bit more. Okay, good. And then at a certain point, it was like the swan never knew that the hands were gone. At a certain point, the swan was flying away. It was its instinct, to do this. And so even then, it's like every event that happens in the historical dimension is a certain kind of like opening into this other kind of dimension, this ultimate dimension. And everything about the Lotus Sutra in this relation kind of just reminds us of that and brings us to an awareness of that. But I have to tell you now, we can talk about the Buddha's understanding and the Buddha's insight and the Buddha's revelation. But we also have to understand it's very much a part of the story, the obstacles that the Buddha had to undergo and that he faced in his life. And Devadatta was there to cause all these troubles. Devadatta, actually, when he became Buddha, when Siddhartha became Buddha in their adult life, Devadatta, this Kshatriya, this ambitious warrior, became a kind of ambitious political monk. Devadatta became a monk also. And the Sangha, the community of monks, numbered something like 500, more than 500 at this time, at this event in the historical life of the Buddha. And there was a king who was the Buddha's chief royal ally in his adult life. But now that king was getting old, and the son of that king fell into kind of a plot with Devadatta, the ambitious monk. You see, this can happen. The monk and the up-and-coming prince, they made a little plan together. The prince was going to do away with his father, take over the kingdom, and then he would cease support for the Buddha as the leader of that community of monks. And that's the religious conscience kind of the community. So if you have the allegiance, of this Sangha on your own side, then that's going to help you in your ambitious plans, So it was like the prince and Devadatta, they had this plan together, a conspiracy, you might say. And Devadatta also helped from his own side. He promulgated what he presented with his charismatic persuasiveness as a more rigorous way to be a monk. And the details are such that, the monks should never take shelter with a family. They should actually not even take donations of clothes. They should wear their own roughly woven clothes. There was many different things that were that persuaded them that this was a more rigorous way of being a monk. And it had a certain appeal, especially among these younger monks who really had not listened to the Buddha that much. Because at this time, the Buddha was actually getting older, and he was, the Buddha did not even think of himself as the leader of his community. And sometimes Devadatta would say, make me the leader of the community. Appoint me. You're getting old. He would say this to the Buddha. And the Buddha would say, I'm an inspiration. I'm a teacher, but I'm not the leader, you see, so I cannot make you the leader. And then Devadatta then would plan with this prince and hatch this plan. Anyway, a lot of the monks were persuaded, and they went with Devadatta. And they lived on this mountain. It wasn't Vulture Peak. And this young prince gave them support and withheld it from the monks that were still loyal to the Buddha. And then along about this time, there were several assassination attempts. Yes. This prince tried to assassinate his own father. That failed. So he kept his father under house arrest without food. And the queen, his own mother, would smuggle her father food. But when they found out about that, they kept her from doing that. And so actually his father did starve, according to the story. And as for the Buddha, Devadatta sponsored, I think it was 3 assassination attempts. In one, there was a swordsman who was going to sneak up the mountain path at night, and by moonlight to where the Buddha was in solitary meditation, he was going to come and assassinate the Buddha. Well, it was nighttime. He went up a certain trail. He saw the Buddha meditating in the moonlight, and the door to his conscience opened in that moment, and he couldn't do it. Instead, he went to the Buddha, and the Buddha, opened his eyes and saw him, and the swordsman said, I have to say, I was sent here to assassinate you, but I cannot do it. And the Buddha said, I understand. Here's what you need to do. Escape. Take your mother and go to Kosala, go to a neighboring kingdom, but go down this trail, down the mountain. Do not go down that trail. And the Buddha understood that Devadatta and the prince had an assassin for the assassin. The original plan was he was going to assassinate the Buddha and then go back down the mountain trail, and then he in turn would be assassinated so that no one would be able to tell the tale. So the Buddha directed him away by another path with instructions about how to be safe along with his mother in the neighboring kingdom. And that was the outcome of one of the assassination attempts. In another assassination attempt on the mountain, I don't think it was Vulture Peak, it was probably another mountain, but they pushed a boulder onto the Buddha, and actually the rock actually wounded his foot. Buddha's foot got wounded by a boulder in an assassination attempt, and it was not a permanent wound, but there was much loss of blood, but he got better, he got all better. And then there was another assassination attempt where a rogue elephant was incited and unchained to attack the Buddha. But according to the story, the Buddha was able to, with his uncanny skill with wild creatures and domestic ones as well, and ones in between, like a rogue elephant, the Buddha was able to calm the creature. And so it was no longer a rogue elephant. And these were all due to Devadatta, you see. And according to the Lotus Sutra, this was happening when the Lotus Sutra happened, it's set historically at the time when Buddha was already old. And so all these events that I just described happened some years earlier, maybe 10 years earlier or something like that. And it is said that that prince was in the audience to hear the Lotus Sutra. And it is said that that prince by now, he was suffering from mental illness because he'd realized the gravity of everything that he had done. Sometimes it's like that. The Buddha was able to connect with brigands and robbers and murderers, and as well as these corrupt princes and kings. And they suffered, and it was their suffering that brought them to the Buddha, so to speak, that compelled them to seek a different way. And the Buddha was able to respond to that. And so that there's a great many wonderful stories about these horrible people who attained enlightenment in their very own lifetimes with the Buddha's help. And it was the same with this prince. He was suffering from mental illness when he realized what he had done, but the Buddha was able to counsel him and untie the knots. That's the phrase that they used. He was able to untie the knots in his psyche, and so that the prince was satisfied to some degree. It is said different things about Devadatta. Some say that he tried to poison the Buddha one more time by scratching him with poison on his fingernails. But in this magical tale, Buddha changed his leg where Devadatta was trying to scratch him. Buddha changed his leg into stone so that his fingernails broke and the poison fell back on him. And then Devadatta was crying out in pain, and he asked, "Oh, Buddha, save me, save me." And the Buddha said, I will save you if you sincerely want me to save you. "Oh, I sincerely want you to save me." But then Devadatta, according to this magical tale, sank into the earth because the earth would swallow up one who uttered an insincere prayer. And even then, in his travail, Devadatta was insincere. That's a folk tale, actually. All we know is from the sublime scriptures is that Buddha said to Devadatta, "You were the one who enlightened me in one of my many previous lives." You see, so all the evil of Devadatta was just something that was in a long kind of unfolding chain. Well, there's a great deal more that I could say, but I think now at this point I just want to mention quickly one Buddha called Never Disparaging. No, one Bodhisattva called Never Disparaging Bodhisattva, I think. I cannot remember the pronunciation of his name in the original language, but he is called Never Disparaging Buddha, a Bodhisattva. And in his Bodhisattva life, in this other dimension, he would see people and he would say to them, this was his practice. He didn't do pilgrimages. He did not meditate. He did not study. This was his way. His way was to go to people and say, "You will one day be a Buddha. You will one day be a Buddha. I see it." And he did see it. He did see it. And he would say that to them. But very often this made them very angry. It was just too much for them. They thought that he was making fun of them, and they would chase him, and they would drive him away with sticks and stones. And if they came at him with sticks and stones, he would say, "I'm glad you're coming at me with sticks and stones, you who will one day be a Buddha, because you could be coming at me with knives and clubs." And so sometimes they would come at him with knives and clubs, and he would say, "I'm glad that you're coming at me with knives and clubs, because you could be blowing me up with fire." And then sometimes they would come at him and blow him up with fire, and he would die. And he would say, "I'm glad to be dying for you, because by dying, I will show you invisibly that you will one day be a Buddha." This was how it was for him as a bodhisattva. And it came to a point where this bodhisattva heard this simultaneous recitation of the Lotus Sutra, it is said. And even this bodhisattva, never disparaging bodhisattva, when he heard this, that was how he became immortal, because the doors of his perception, to use a Blakean phrase, the doors of his perception were opened, and he realized that his motivation was very pure and very real, that they all would become bodhisattvas. But when the doors of his perception were ultimately opened, what he realized was the simultaneity and the timelessness of this bodhisattvic reality, where in a certain sense he saw everything that they would become in its total fulfillment happening in the present moment of his own consciousness. You see, this was kind of a little miracle in the trichiliocosm, you see, which is always going around us, going on with us all the time. Well, as always now, I can see that I think that I've gone on about this a little bit too much. Not too much, actually, but it's time to kind of like put a cap on it, so to speak. And so we've seen the concept of the bodhisattva, of the universality of it, of the multidimensional nature of it, and the way that the reality of it can be opened up to us in these strange scriptural stories. We've seen a little bit about the development of Buddhism in the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition, and we've had a little bit of depictions of this notion of skillful means and how that can work, and we've had a little bit of an understanding of the I don't know how to call it this, but I'm going to have to use this word, inclusivity of this notion or this promise that all beings are capable of complete and full emancipation, and this is a way that we can understand it, and So it's offered like food for contemplation. What it is really, of course, is a fourfold vision that we have seen, and that's what the Lotus Sutra is in a certain sense. It's an offering to our meditative consciousness. It's an offering, and it's important in my own mind to think of it as an offering because it is for us to receive it, and that's where many, many things can happen. It can't be given to us, it's just offered to us, and it's up to us to see the value of it because there is energy in seeing the value of something. It's a kind of a poetic and creative moral energy. And so this is the way that we can kind of sort of understand it. So that's a little bit about the Lotus Sutra. And so at this point then, I thank you for your heroic listening. And I have to say to you that heroic listening is one thing, but attentiveness is something else. And it's good attentiveness. So by heroic listening, I mean good attentiveness. I thank you for that. It's a good energy in this world. So I say to you, thank you, and so long for now.